So I finished reading the book of Second Corinthians yesterday and started on the book of Romans today, and I'm happy to share my lessons with you. Now, Paul wrote this letter to the Romans before he ever met them. He hadn't even gone to Rome yet, but he sent this letter ahead of his visit, and he wrote it apparently while he was still in Corinth. And the basis of this letter was to help them understand what God had given to them freely through Christ. And for me, it was a lesson of to know the things that I had freely through Christ as well. Now, the first time the church in Rome was mentioned was in Acts 18, when we met Priscilla and Aquila after the emperor or the governor had driven all the Jews out of Rome, had basically kicked them out. So now this is like 5 years later. So they were kicked out, but 5 years later they were allowed back in, right? But by the time that they came back, the church was different, because now there were more Gentiles in the church and there were Jews in the church. And in the common theme that we have seen, there was division because the Jews came with the laws of Moses and the circumcision and all those things, while the Gentiles obviously had a different orientation. And Paul wrote this letter as an attempt to bring unity using the scriptures through the gospel. He highlighted the sinfulness of everyone, that all of us as humans, were sinful. So he was talking both the Jews and the Gentiles, and the wrath of God was the punishment against sin that we're all sort of subject to. I think that's what he just started to just show that commonality, that, hey guys, nobody's sin is better than the other, or nobody's like more holy than the other, right? So what was interesting to note is that God has active and passive wrath. Now, if you remember, we learned about this in the Old Testament, right? So passive wrath was what Paul explained in the first chapter, 28 to 32. And while we may think that people getting away with sin or evil is just them getting away with it, but it's actually God giving people over to their sins. And it's actually quite terrifying. It's not freeing. It's not liberating at all, because it will ultimately lead to death and separation from God. And you know that there's always judgment at the other side of it, right? So Paul warned against looking down on sinners in those verses as well, because the people, as well as us, I thought about it, could also be guilty of the same thing. This is one lesson that I've learned, and I have to keep reminding myself, I keep relearning every day. Just because someone sins differently than me doesn't make me better than them, or doesn't give me the permission to look down on them. And another thing that actually came through to me also is getting to know God through his word, and getting more knowledge has the ability to actually puff you up and make you feel like you know so much, but you really don't. So yeah, I really took that lesson away, and I hope you would too. Now, we all have access to God's grace. We have all received incredible kindness from him, and we shouldn't take it for granted, and we shouldn't abuse it by judging others who haven't taken advantage of the grace or haven't come to the knowledge, saving knowledge of God. Now, yes, who haven't received justification. So grace isn't a path to continue sinning, like we said the other day. It's a change agent to turn us back to God and turn our hearts back to the Lord. Now, I love how Paul painted a picture of how being Jewish or Gentile didn't matter when it came to righteousness. Nobody was righteous. Nobody could ever get righteous through the law, because at this point, the Jews thought keeping the laws made them righteous, but no one was righteous, and no matter how much they tried to obey the law, they couldn't obtain righteousness through it. Righteousness only comes from faith in Jesus Christ. Now, here's my hashtag getting to know God lesson. Jesus has given us the gift of grace, faith, justification, and redemption, and he give us all these gifts freely. In chapter 3, verses 23 to 24, it says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified freely by his grace through redemption that came by Christ Jesus." Let's learn to not take any of these things for granted, and extend grace to others who may not know Jesus yet, because we have grace because of our knowledge of him. So instead, we should even try to make sure that others have that knowledge so they can receive grace as well. Thank you for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to share my lessons with you, and I look forward to doing the same tomorrow, God willing. Have a wonderful day. God bless you. Bye.